In the mist-shrouded highlands of ancient Scotland, where eagles soared above granite peaks and warriors painted themselves blue for battle, a confrontation was brewing that would echo through the ages. The year was 83 CE, and the most powerful empire the world had ever known stood poised to crush the last free tribes of Britain. Yet on a windswept mountain called Mons Graupius, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A handful of painted warriors, dismissed by Rome as barbarians, would deliver a blow so devastating that it would halt the empire's northward march forever. This is not the story you learned in school. This is not the tale of Roman triumph that fills the history books. This is the forgotten victory of the Picts, the painted people who dared to stand against legions that had conquered Gaul, crushed Germanic tribes, and brought kings to their knees across 3 continents. At Mons Graupius, these fierce Highland warriors would prove that even Rome could bleed. The stakes could not have been higher. For nearly 4 decades, Roman boots had trampled British soil. Cities burned, tribes submitted, and the eagle standards of Rome cast their shadow across the land. From the white cliffs of Dover to the wild borderlands of Wales, resistance had crumbled before the disciplined might of the legions. But in the far north, beyond Hadrian's future wall, the Caledonians still ran free, and Rome would not tolerate freedom on its frontier. Leading the Roman war machine was Gnaeus Julius Agricola, a man whose very name struck fear into Celtic hearts. This was no ordinary general. Agricola was a master of both sword and politics, a commander who combined brutal efficiency with tactical brilliance. He had already crushed the Ordovices in Wales and brought the proud tribes of northern England to heel. Now, with 7 years of British campaigns behind him, he had set his sights on the ultimate prize: complete conquest of the island. The final chapter in Rome's British story. But standing in his path were warriors unlike any Rome had faced before. The Caledonians were not the disorganized rabble that Roman propaganda portrayed. These were the descendants of Bronze Age warriors, hardened by centuries of clan warfare and shaped by the unforgiving highland landscape. They knew every glen, every pass, every hidden path through their mountain homeland, and they had chosen their ground carefully. The mountain of Mons Grapius rose like a sleeping giant from the highland moors. Its slopes, covered in heather and scattered boulders, offered natural defenses that would make any frontal assault a nightmare. The Caledonians had not stumbled into this battle by accident. They had drawn the Romans here, to this place where numbers would count for little and where the disciplined formations that had conquered the world would find themselves broken on highland steel. As dawn broke over the battlefield, 2 armies faced each other across a valley that would soon run red with blood. On one side stood the might of Rome, legionnaires in gleaming mail, auxiliary cavalry from across the empire, and siege engines that had battered down the walls of Jerusalem. Their standards caught the morning light, bronze eagles and silver wolves that had led Roman armies to victory from Britain to the Euphrates. Opposite them, a sight that would have stirred the hearts of every free Briton still breathing. Thousands of Caledonian warriors covered the mountainside like a living tapestry of defiance. Their shields bore the symbols of dozens of clans, their spears caught the highland wind, and their war cries echoed off the granite peaks. These men had not come to die quietly. They had come to show Rome that some peoples could not be conquered. The Roman sources tell us this battle was a crushing victory for the legions. They speak of thousands of Celtic dead and barely a scratch on Roman pride. But the Roman sources lie. They had to lie. Because what happened at Mons Graupius was so shocking, so devastating to Roman confidence, that the truth had to be buried beneath layers of propaganda and imperial spin. Here's what really happened on that fateful day. The Caledonians had learned from every defeat their southern cousins had suffered. They had studied Roman tactics, Roman weaknesses, Roman arrogance, and they had crafted a battle plan that would turn Rome's greatest strengths against itself. As Agricola surveyed the enemy position from his command post, he must have felt confident. His legions had never failed him. His auxiliary troops were seasoned veterans. His cavalry could sweep around the enemy flanks and turn retreat into massacre. Everything about this battle favored Rome, or so it seemed. The Caledonian leader, a chieftain whose name has been lost to history but whose courage would echo through the ages, had positioned his warriors with cunning that would have impressed Sun Tzu himself. The main body of his army held the high ground, their shields locked in a wall of iron and determination. But hidden in the glens and behind the rocky outcrops, other forces waited. Warriors who knew these mountains like their own heartbeats, ready to strike when the moment was right. When the Roman advance began, it must have looked like every other British battle. The legions marched forward in perfect formation, their hobnailed boots keeping perfect time, their shields overlapping in the deadly testudo that had crushed opposition across the known world. Behind them came the auxiliaries, Germanic and Gallic warriors, who had traded their freedom for Roman gold. And on the flanks, cavalry units prepared to exploit any weakness in the Celtic line. But as the Romans climbed toward the Caledonian position, something began to go wrong. The ground was rougher than expected. The heather caught at their feet. Rocks shifted under the weight of armored men. The perfect Roman formation began to stretch and strain as soldiers struggled to maintain their footing on the treacherous slope. And that's when the Caledonians struck their first blow, not with sword or spear, but with the landscape itself. They had chosen this ground not just for its defensive value, but because it would break the Roman machine. As the legions struggled upward, their formation fragmenting with every step, gaps began to appear in their line. Gaps that Highland warriors had been waiting to exploit. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Roman military history. This was not the neat, predictable clash of formation against formation that Roman generals preferred. This was chaos, beautiful and terrible, as painted warriors seemed to materialize from the very rocks themselves. They struck where the Romans were weakest, melted away when faced with organized resistance, and struck again before their enemies could react. For the first time in decades, Roman soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down, couldn't predict, couldn't crush with their traditional tactics. The Caledonians fought like wolves, in packs, coordinating their attacks with horn calls that echoed off the mountainside. They used the terrain like an extra weapon, drawing Roman units into traps among the boulders, then falling on them from three sides at once. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher over Mons Graupius, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. The invincible Roman war machine was grinding to a halt. Units that should have swept the field found themselves bogged down in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Cavalry charges that should have shattered the enemy line found themselves floundering in broken ground where horses could barely stand. And in the heart of the battle, where the fighting was fiercest and the stakes highest, Caledonian warriors were proving that courage and cunning could triumph over discipline and numbers. They were writing a new chapter in the story of resistance, one that Rome would spend centuries trying to forget. The screams of dying men mingled with the clash of iron as the battle reached its crescendo. Roman centurions, veterans who had seen action from the Rhine to the Danube, found themselves shouting orders that went unheeded in the chaos. Their carefully drilled maniples, the backbone of Roman military might, were being torn apart by warriors who seemed to fight with the fury of the Highland storms themselves. What made this battle so devastating for Rome was not just the ferocity of the Caledonian resistance, but the complete breakdown of everything that made Roman armies superior. Their discipline meant nothing when enemy warriors appeared and vanished like ghosts among the heather. Their superior armor became a liability on slopes where agility mattered more than protection. Their famous siege engines, designed to batter down city walls, sat useless in terrain where they could barely be deployed. The Caledonians had turned the very nature of warfare upside down. Instead of meeting Roman strength head-on, they attacked Roman weaknesses. They targeted officers, disrupting command structures. They focused on auxiliary units rather than the heavily armored legionnaires, knowing that breaking the army's support troops would cripple its effectiveness. Most brilliantly, they used the mountain itself as their greatest ally. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Mons Grapius, the unthinkable began to happen. Roman units were not just struggling, they were breaking. Entire cohorts found themselves surrounded, cut off from support, fighting desperately just to survive. The eagle standards that had led Roman armies to glory across 3 continents were now rallying points for desperate last stands rather than symbols of inevitable victory. Gnaeus Julius Agricola watched his perfect battle plan crumble from his command position. This was the general who had conquered Wales, who had brought the proud tribes of northern England to their knees, who had never known defeat in 7 years of British campaigning. Now he was witnessing something that would haunt Roman military thinking for generations. His legions, the finest fighting force in the world, were being outfought by painted barbarians. The psychological impact on the Roman soldiers was devastating. These men had joined the legions believing in Roman superiority, in the destiny of their empire to rule the world. They had marched behind eagles that had never tasted defeat, served under generals whose names were spoken with reverence across the Mediterranean. Now they found themselves trapped in a nightmare where nothing worked as it should, where their training counted for nothing, where barbarians fought like demons from the underworld. Celtic war horns echoed across the battlefield, their haunting calls coordinating attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Caledonians had developed a system of battlefield communication that allowed them to operate as a single organism, despite being scattered across the mountainside. When one clan struck at Roman flanks, others would simultaneously attack supply lines or command posts, creating a web of destruction that no Roman general had ever faced. The warriors themselves fought with a desperation born of generations of resistance. These were not just soldiers, they were the last free men of Britain. Behind them lay not just their homes, but the final remnant of a way of life that had existed since before Rome was even founded. Every blow they struck was for fathers who had died fighting Roman occupation, for children who would grow up as slaves if this battle was lost, for a culture that Rome sought to erase from the earth. Their weapons, dismissed by Romans as primitive, proved devastatingly effective in the close-quarters combat among the rocks. Long Celtic swords could reach around Roman shields in ways that short gladii could not counter. Spears with barbed heads created wounds that would not heal cleanly. War axes, wielded by men whose fathers had taught them to swing them before they could properly walk, shattered Roman armor that had been forged in the workshops of Italy. But it was not just superior knowledge of the terrain or even individual courage that won the day for the Caledonians. It was their understanding of something that Rome had forgotten in its centuries of conquest. They knew that some things are worth more than life itself. Freedom was not just a word to them. It was the air they breathed, the blood in their veins, the fire that drove them to fight with inhuman ferocity against impossible odds. As evening approached and the highland mist began to roll down from the peaks, the scope of the Roman disaster became clear. Cohorts that had marched proudly up the mountain slopes that morning were now scattered fragments, their survivors desperately seeking escape routes through terrain they did not understand. Officers who had commanded with absolute authority found themselves isolated from their men, fighting for their lives with common soldiers in the gathering darkness. The auxiliary troops, many of them Celtic warriors from conquered tribes, began to waver. Why should they die for Rome when their own people were proving that the legions could be beaten? Some simply melted away into the highland gloom. Others turned their weapons on their Roman commanders. The entire structure of imperial military power was coming apart in the highland heather. Agricola found himself facing a choice no Roman general should ever have to make. He could throw in his reserves, risk his entire army in a desperate attempt to salvage victory from disaster. Or he could sound the retreat, admit defeat, and watch his political career die along with Roman prestige in Britain. Either choice would echo through the halls of power in Rome, neither would be easily forgiven. The Caledonian victory at Mons Graupius sent shockwaves far beyond the wind-swept battlefield. Word of the defeat spread like wildfire through the Celtic communities still under Roman rule. In Wales, in Cornwall, in the hills of northern England, men who had bent their knees to Rome began to whisper of resistance once more. The empire that had seemed invincible suddenly looked very mortal indeed. For Rome, the implications were staggering. Here was an empire that had built its reputation on the simple principle that resistance was futile, that Roman victory was as certain as the rising sun. Yet in the mists of Caledonia, that certainty had been shattered like glass against Highland stone. The news that filtered back to the imperial court was carefully sanitized, transformed from catastrophic defeat into tactical withdrawal. But those who understood military matters could read between the lines. The Emperor Domitian, sitting on his throne in Rome, received reports that spoke of successful punitive raids and strategic repositioning. But he also received casualty lists that told a very different story. Entire auxiliary units listed as missing. Centurions who would never return to their families in Gaul or Germania, supply trains that had vanished into the highland mist. The mathematics of warfare told the truth that propaganda tried to hide. What made the defeat even more shocking was the identity of the victors. These were not the disciplined armies of Carthage or the professional soldiers of Germanic kingdoms. These were tribal warriors, men who fought naked from the waist up, who painted themselves with blue woad, who had no formal military training by Roman standards. Yet they had accomplished what Hannibal had failed to do at Cannae, what Arminius had achieved in the Teutoburg forest. They had proven that Rome could be beaten by anyone with enough courage and cunning. The psychological warfare that followed the battle was as devastating as the physical combat itself. Caledonian raiders began appearing throughout Roman Britain, striking at isolated outposts, ambushing supply convoys, and melting away before reinforcements could arrive. They carried with them more than just weapons and spoils. They carried the knowledge that Roman soldiers could be killed, Roman formations could be broken, Roman pride could be humbled. In the tribal halls of unconquered Scotland, bards began composing songs that would echo through the glens for generations. They sang of the day when painted warriors had made eagles fall, when Highland steel had drunk deep of Roman blood, when the mountains themselves had risen up to defend the free people of Caledonia. These were not just victory songs, they were recruiting anthems, calls to arms that would inspire resistance for centuries to come. But perhaps the most profound impact of Mons Graupius was what it revealed about the nature of empire itself. Rome had built its power on the assumption that civilization would always triumph over barbarism, that organization would always defeat chaos, that the disciplined would always overcome the passionate. The Caledonians had proven these assumptions false. They had shown that there were forms of warfare, forms of courage, forms of determination that lay outside Roman understanding. The defeat forced Roman military thinkers to confront uncomfortable questions. How do you conquer a people who refuse to be conquered? How do you defeat an enemy who won't stand still and fight by your rules? How do you maintain an empire when the foundations of that empire can be shaken by a handful of painted warriors on a misty mountainside? These questions would haunt Roman strategic thinking for the rest of the empire's existence. Agricola himself became a casualty of the battle in ways that went far beyond physical wounds. His career, once destined for the highest honors Rome could bestow, stalled completely. He was recalled from Britain under mysterious circumstances, his governorship cut short, his dreams of further conquest abandoned. The man who had been hailed as the conqueror of Britain became instead a cautionary tale about the limits of Roman power. The official histories would later claim that Agricola had achieved a great victory at Mons Graupius, that he had killed thousands of Caledonians while losing only a handful of his own men. But actions spoke louder than words. If the victory had been so complete, why was the conquest of Scotland abandoned? Why did Roman armies never again venture so far north? Why did Hadrian, just decades later, build a wall to keep the Caledonians out, rather than marching north to finish what Agricola had supposedly started? The truth was written not in the sanitized accounts of court historians, but in the strategic decisions that followed. Rome, the empire that never admitted defeat, quietly abandoned its ambitions in northern Britain. The legions that had marched confidently toward Mons Graupius would spend the rest of their service in Britain looking over their shoulders, wondering when painted warriors might emerge from the highland mist. For the Caledonians, victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of their finest warriors had died on the slopes of Mons Graupius, men whose loss would be felt in every clan hall throughout the highlands. But their sacrifice had achieved something that mere survival could not. They had bought their people time, generations of freedom that would allow Celtic culture to survive and flourish, while Roman civilization rose and fell. The battle also established patterns of resistance that would define Scottish history for the next 1,000 years. The tactics used at Mons Graupius, the hit-and-run warfare, the use of terrain as a weapon, the coordination between scattered clan groups, would be employed again and again by Scottish warriors facing English armies at Stirling Bridge, at Bannockburn, at Culloden. The spirit of resistance that blazed on that highland mountainside would echo through the centuries. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Caledonian victory was how quickly it was forgotten by those who needed most to remember it. Roman historians buried the truth beneath layers of imperial propaganda. Later, chroniclers, writing from the comfort of Roman cities, accepted the official version without question. The voices of the victors, the Celtic bards who had witnessed the battle, were dismissed as barbarian fantasy. History, as always, was written by the civilized, but the mountains remembered. In the glens and corries of the Scottish Highlands, in the stone circles where druids had once practiced their ancient rites, in the burial cairns of warriors who had died for freedom, the memory of Mons Graupius lived on. It lived in the wind that howled through the heather, in the mist that clung to the peaks, in the very stones that had witnessed painted warriors humble the pride of Rome. The legacy of that forgotten battle extended far beyond the borders of Britain. News of the Caledonian victory spread through the Celtic networks that connected Ireland to Gaul, Brittany to Wales. In every corner of the Celtic world, men and women who had accepted Roman rule as inevitable began to wonder if resistance might still be possible. The flame of freedom, nearly extinguished by decades of conquest, flickered back to life in hearts that had given up hope. Even in the heart of the empire itself, among the slaves and conquered peoples who served Roman masters, whispers began to spread. If painted barbarians in the far north could defeat Roman legions, what might be possible elsewhere? The psychological impact of Mons Graupius reached into every corner of Roman society, planting seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into the rebellions and invasions that would tear the empire apart. The battle marked a turning point, not just in British history, but in the history of resistance itself. It proved that empires, no matter how powerful, could be challenged by peoples with the courage to fight for their freedom. It showed that there were limits to what force alone could achieve, that the human spirit, properly inspired, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But the true genius of the Caledonian strategy at Mons Graupius lay not in what they did during the battle, but in what they did after it. While Roman commanders throughout history had sought to destroy enemy armies completely, the Caledonians understood something far more profound. They knew that the greatest victories are not always won with swords, but with symbols. And on that misty highland morning, they created a symbol that would outlive empires. As the last Roman cohorts limped away from the battlefield, their wounded carried on improvised stretchers, their pride as shattered as their formations, the Caledonians did not pursue. They could have hunted the retreating legions through the glens, picked them off in small groups, turned tactical defeat into complete annihilation. But they chose a different path. They chose to let Rome remember what had happened, to carry the memory of defeat back to every fortress from Hadrian's Wall to the Mediterranean. This decision revealed the sophisticated political thinking that lay behind Caledonian military success. These were not the mindless barbarians of Roman propaganda, driven only by bloodlust and tribal hatred. They were strategic thinkers, who understood that sometimes the most powerful blow you can strike against an enemy is the one that leaves them alive to contemplate their humiliation. Every Roman soldier who survived Mons Graupius became a walking testament to Celtic martial prowess. The aftermath of the battle saw Agricola's army withdraw, not in the organized fashion of a strategic repositioning, but in the hurried manner of men who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. Supply lines that had stretched confidently into Highland territory were hastily contracted. Forward bases that had been established to support the conquest of northern Scotland were quietly abandoned. The great Roman war machine, which had rolled inexorably northward for 7 years, suddenly ground to a halt. In the tribal councils that met in the weeks following the battle, Caledonian chieftains made decisions that would echo through the ages. They could have pressed their advantage, launched raids deep into Roman territory, perhaps even threatened the legion's main bases in northern England. But they recognized that their victory was more valuable as a defensive achievement than as a springboard for offensive action. They had proven their point. The north would remain free. And so the painted warriors of Caledonia accomplished what no empire since has managed to forget. They proved that freedom, when defended by those willing to die for it, can humble even the mightiest powers. At Mons Graupius, Rome learned that some battles are won not by the largest armies, but by the fiercest hearts. The Highland Mist still carries their victory song today.